Hey friends, Matt aka Martiln here, and in this video I'm going to be teaching you the basics of how to create common drum patterns for different genres of electronic music such as house, trance, techno, drum and bass, dubstep, and more, and how they all work on very similar principles. By the end of this video, you should have the knowledge to be able to quickly create your very own drum patterns for pretty much any genre of electronic music that you can then vary to your liking. Let's get started. So first up, in order to be able to understand how to create and program your very own drum patterns, you need a bit of an understanding of how bars and beats work in music in general. So music is typically broken up into what we call bars, and each bar is broken up into a certain amount of beats. In electronic dance music and a lot of popular music in general, we typically work in 4 beats to a bar, otherwise known as 4/4 time. If you're used to working in any digital audio workstation, such as Ableton Live, if you see a 4/4, this is denoting the time signature, and this is pretty commonly what we're going to work with. A note that lasts for a whole beat is known as a quarter note, and we can further divide up quarter notes into 1/8 notes and 16th notes. There are 2 1/8 notes to a quarter note, and there are 2 16th notes to an 1/8 note, or 4 16th notes to a quarter note. The speed of these beats is determined by what's called the BPM, otherwise known as the beats per minute, or the tempo. Now, the BPM can drastically affect the style or genre of music that we're working in, so as we go through this video, we're going to be changing BPM a lot to showcase how these different drum patterns work in different beats per minute values. Now, when it comes to sequencing in drum patterns, we typically want to work in 16th notes, which is that there are 4 slots in time that we can put in a note for every beat of our bar. And for each bar, we can also give certain beat divisions and placements different names. Now, these names may vary a little bit depending on some factors, but in general, we have downbeat, which is the very first beat of a bar, the backbeat, which is the second and the 4th beat of every bar, and the offbeat, which is every second 1/8 note of a bar, or the 1/8 note halfway between each quarter note or beat. By the way, just as a note, a drum pattern is also sometimes called a drum beat, and in this particular instance, the word beat is not relating to beats in a bar. It's just something that we use to describe a drum pattern, and we call it a beat. I'm going to try and use the word drum pattern throughout this video just to stop any confusion, but if you hear me say the word drum beat, just know that I'm referring to the drum pattern. Okay, so in order to start here inside of Ableton Live, I have a drum rack loaded up with a few core sounds inside of it. And these are the core sounds that we're going to use to showcase all of our different drum patterns in this video. Now, the different drum sounds that I've got can be broken up into a few different categories. The first major category is our accented sounds, and these are our kick drum and our snare drum. Then the other core sounds that we have are our closed hi-hat and our open hi-hat. And these sounds are designed to kind of fit around our accented sounds as our kick and our snare drum and keep the movement kind of consistent throughout the entirety of the drum pattern. Then we have a few extra sounds. We have 3 toms from low to high. We have 2 cymbals, a crash cymbal and a ride cymbal. And then 2 extra percussive sounds, a clap and a rim hit. Also, just a quick note on sounds and genre. The drum sounds you use can also very drastically affect the style or genre of music that you're working in. In this video, we're going to be using a really basic set of sounds that come from a Roland TR-909 drum machine, but this is just going to be to demonstrate different rhythmic patterns in different styles and genres. If you take these concepts and experiment with different kick drums, snare drums, hi-hats, and other sounds, you can quite drastically affect the genre or style of music that you're working in, particularly when it comes to electronic music. Okay, so now that we have our core sounds and an understanding of how bars and beats work in music, let's get to programming the foundation that pretty much every single drum beat in electronic music is built around. So all I'm going to do here is create a MIDI clip in our first clip slot in our drums track. You can do this by creating a MIDI clip in whatever digital audio workstation you're in. This MIDI clip is going to be a single bar long. We can see we have 4 beats, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. And our foundation is going to start with our snare on every backbeat. If you remember what a backbeat is, it is the 2nd and 4th beat of the bar. So I'm going to input a snare on our 2nd beat and a snare on our 4th beat. And then the last aspect of our foundation is a kick drum on our downbeat, remembering that our downbeat is the first beat of the bar. So let's input a kick drum on our downbeat. And now at 120 beats per minute, this is what our foundation sounds like. And this is the foundational pattern for pretty much any style or type of drum beat or pattern that you will find in electronic music. Not all of them, but this is a really good starting point. We'll show you how to vary this later on. So now that we have our foundation, let's look at the two main types of patterns that we can build off of this foundation. This first pattern is called a 4 on the floor or a 4 to the floor pattern. So starting with our foundation, all we're going to do from here is add a kick drum onto every single beat. So we have our kick drum and our downbeat. Let's add one to our second beat, our third beat, and our fourth beat. And with this pattern, we have our kick drum accenting every single beat of the bar, keeping a consistent tempo, whilst we have our snare on the back beats, creating this kind of interesting forward and up momentum. And this type of drum pattern forms the foundation for electronic music genres such as house, techno, trance, and hardcore. We can further expand on this pattern with our other core sounds in the form of our closed hi-hats and our open hi-hats. In order to add some more forward momentum to this sound, I can add a closed hi-hat on every offbeat, remembering that our offbeats are every second eighth note. We can see here our grid is currently divided into 16th notes, so if I take the third 16th note of every bar, I'm placing a closed hi-hat on every single off beat, or the second eighth note of every beat. If I move this closed hi-hat to an open hi-hat, we get more of an open and higher energy kind of pattern. Let's select all these closed hi-hats, drag them up to an open hi-hat, and we can further increase the amount of forward momentum that this drum pattern is giving us by adding closed hi-hats on every second 16th note. So that is filling in the gaps between our kicks and our open hi-hats. So let's add a closed hi-hat here, 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 and in every second 16th note. Now, if we take this drum pattern that we have and play it back at different tempos, we can imply different genres of electronic music. Anywhere between about 120 to 130 beats per minute, we would say falls into house or techno music territory. So at 120 beats per minute, this is our pattern. I could put this to 125, a little bit faster, and up to 128, which is a very common house music tempo. And in between 130 to 140 is still kind of considered techno and could be leaning more towards trance at the higher end of the spectrum. So if we put this up to 135, we're now sitting in kind of a higher tempo techno territory. 138 is a pretty typical tempo for trance music. And 140 to 150 can also kind of put us in that trance music territory. So if I change this to 145, we're now playing this pattern back at a much faster tempo. And now if you want to go really crazy, you can put this tempo up to about 170 to 180 beats per minute, and that brings you into hardcore territory. So if we put this up to 170 beats per minute, have a listen to what we have now. If you're working in these higher tempo genres, sometimes you might want to get rid of the second 16th note closed hi-hats so you have a bit less of a frantic drum pattern. Let's select all these closed hi-hats, press the 0 key to mute them, and this is what we have. So as you can see, the 4 on the floor drum pattern works really well in these different types of genres where we want to accent every single beat. But it is not the only drum pattern that is typically used in electronic music genres. The next core pattern that pretty much all the other electronic music genres are built off of is what's known as a two-step pattern. So for the two-step pattern, I'm going to create a new MIDI clip and I'm going to turn our tempo to 125 beats per minute. This is a pretty arbitrary value. We'll be changing this later on. So once again, we're going to start with our foundation, a kick drum on the downbeat and a snare on every backbeat, so the second and fourth beats of the bar. Just to remind you what this sounds like. And this time, instead of adding a kick drum onto every single beat, we're just going to add one more kick drum into this pattern. And this kick drum is going to come on the off beat of the third beat. So we're going to go to our third beat of the bar, and on the second eighth note, or the off beat of this third beat, I'm going to add a kick drum. And this is a really simple pattern that is used in genres such as UK garage, breaks, and drum and bass. From here, we can add our extra core sounds in the form of our closed and open hi-hats. And what I'm going to do with the closed hi-hats is basically just have them filling in every single eighth note that isn't currently being played. So we'll go to our closed hi-hat, add one on the second offbeat. on the third offbeat, on beat 3, and on the last offbeat of the bar. Once again, adjusting the tempo here will bring us into different styles and genres. In a tempo of the kind of high 120s to the mid 130s, we're in that more garage territory. So if I play this back at say 132 beats per minute, garage kind of breaks territory. If we speed this up anywhere between 140 to 150 beats per minute, we're sitting more in our breaks tempo category. So let's set this to 145. And if we go up to between 170 and 180 beats per minute, we're sitting more in drum and bass territory. So let's set this to 174 beats per minute. It's also worth noting here that we can substitute some of these closed hi-hats for open hi-hats. I might put, say, these two first hi-hats on open hi-hats, as well as this last hi-hat onto an open hi-hat. Or I could flip it around, move all of these back to closed hi-hats, and move this one to an open hi-hat. You can also play around with having closed and open hi-hats on every single eighth note, so I could add a closed hi-hat on every single one of these eighth notes, and maybe set the offbeat hi-hats to open hi-hats. The key element here is the kick drum being on the downbeat and the offbeat of the third beat. I'm going to undo that really quickly and we'll go back to just having our closed hi-hats in those original positions. And now let's turn our tempo down to about 140 to 150 BPM. Let's set this to 140. Now, if we take this same two-step pattern and we extend it out so that every eighth note now becomes a quarter note long, so we're playing it back at what's called half time, we now get into genres such as dubstep and trap. Ableton Live has a really easy way of doing this by going over to the notes section and pressing on the ×2 button. And you'll see that if I do this, our 1 bar clip is now going to become 2 bars long and our notes retain their relative spacing to one another. If I play this back now, have a listen to what it sounds like. This forms the basis for a lot of dubstep music, and if we take our closed hi-hats and start playing them back at 16th notes, we start to get more into trap music. Gets a little bit obnoxious, but we can start to vary velocity and stuff, which we'll look at later. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and learning a bunch from it so far, I'd love to invite you to leave a like down below, subscribe if you're new, and if you're really enjoying these videos and some of my other content, why not consider heading on over to my Buy Me a Coffee, where you can support me by buying me a coffee, becoming a member, or getting a bunch of cool stuff from my shop. There's a link down in the description below. So from here, we can start to add in some of those other extra sounds that we were talking about before in order to create some more interest in our drum patterns. The first thing that we can consider when adding in extra sounds is what's called syncopation. Now, syncopation is basically where we have somewhat accented elements that don't fall in line with the main beat or pulse of our pattern. The more elements that we don't have synced up with that consistent pulse, the more syncopated we consider our drum pattern to be. But we can add in syncopated elements to give a sense of groove, movement, and interest to our drum pattern that we might not otherwise have. So let's go back to our 4 on the floor drum beat, change our tempo to 128 beats per minute. Now let's look at some common syncopated rhythms for this particular type of drum beat. We're going to start first by using our clap sound. Now, the first type of syncopated rhythm that we're going to add is something you'll hear in music like moombahton and whatnot. So if we take this clap and add it onto the last 16th note of the first beat and the offbeat of the second beat, and we do that for all the beats of the bar, take a listen to what we have. If we mute our open hi-hats, this is a really common pattern that creates some really interesting movement and forward momentum in a track. We can take this same concept now and move some of these notes around. Let's take this clap, move it to the last 16th note here, and now we've got a slightly different pattern that we have extended over 1 bar. We can even have these same sounds used to accent the second 16th note of certain bars. As an example, let's delete this particular clap sound and let's add a clap here on this second 16th note of beat 2. Or we can grab these two claps, move them over to the first beat. And these are some really common syncopated patterns. We could even play these in different sounds, such as our toms. I could have the low tom playing this pattern here where these last two claps are. And then if we add in our open and closed hi-hats, and this just shows you some ways that you can add syncopation to your 4-on-the-floor drum pattern. But what about a 2-step pattern? So here I've gone ahead and recreated our original 2-step foundation pattern. This is what it sounds like at 128 beats per minute. And this time I'm going to take our rim hit and add a rim hit at the last 16th note of our second beat and the second 16th note of our third beat. And now we have this interesting extra forward momentum in this middle part of the beat here. We can also take this concept a little bit further and add these rim shots to the kind of leading 16th notes into our snares. So I could add a rim hit here and a rim hit here. And even the last 16th note of the entire bar. We could also change these rim hits for claps. And if you're feeling really interesting, you could even change these for snares, but just at a lower velocity. Let's undo that, change them back to rims, and let's delete these additional rim hits here and leave our first few. And now look at how we can add extra kick drums into this pattern to create an even more interesting rhythm. So as well as having our kick drum on the downbeat and the offbeat of the third beat, we can also add kick drums basically anywhere else in here to create even more interest. For example, I could go and add a kick drum on the offbeat of beat 1, maybe even the offbeat of beat 2, or potentially even on some of the 16th notes, depending on the tempo. So we could move our kick drum on our offbeat of the first beat to the last 16th note to create some interesting movement as well. If we again take this idea, speed up our tempo to 140 beats per minute, and then halftime, we can take these concepts even further, except now we have extra 16th notes to play around with if we want to. I could say take this kick drum here, move it back a 16th note, add a kick drum onto the offbeat of the last beat of the first bar, and maybe even go wild and add some extra kick drums here as well. Play around with these concepts and add some syncopation to your own drum beats. Now, it's also worth noting that not all genres and styles of electronic music have this very straight feeling to them. Some have what we call this swung feeling, which is this kind of skippy feeling that we're going to show you how to create here. Now, this is really common in genres such as garage, but it can also be a great way to just add some extra humanness to your drum patterns in pretty much any genre. First off, let's create a new 4-on-the-floor drum pattern. So again, we'll set our kick drum on every single beat and our snare drum on our back beats. And then I'm going to add an open hi-hat on every single offbeat. I'm going to set the tempo back to about 128 beats per minute. And now we're going to talk about swing. So swing is basically where we offset every either second 8th note or second 16th note in our pattern. For example, here I have an open hi-hat on every second 8th note. In order to add what we call an 8th note swing to this particular pattern, I would take all of the notes that fall on the second 8th notes of our pattern. In this case, it's all our open hi-hats, and I would have it so they play slightly later than when the actual 8th note is occurring. So here is our 4-on-the-floor pattern at the moment. And have a listen to what happens as I offset these second 8th notes. We start to get this interesting rolling forward momentum that's being applied to the pattern. If we undo that and set our hi-hats back to being on 8th notes, let's add a closed hi-hat on every second 16th note. And now we can apply a 16th note swing by doing the exact same thing, except offsetting every second 16th note instead of every second 8th note. So currently this is what our straight groove sounds like. And if I take all of the notes that fall on every second 16th note, which in the case of this beat is our closed hi-hat, and start to slowly offset them, have a listen to the feel that this creates. This is a common kind of groove and pattern you'll feel and hear in a lot of house music and garage music. We can again even apply this to our two-step pattern. So for example, I could just turn this into a two-step pattern by removing the second and fourth kick drums and changing our third kick drum here to the offbeat of the third beat. And now take a listen to what this does. Now, it's worth noting that if you want to maintain a consistent swing across the entirety of your drum pattern, if you apply this offset of, say, every second 16th note, and you have multiple sounds on that same 16th note, for example, if we had a clap here and here, you would want to apply the exact same amount of offset to all of those sounds you had layered on every second 16th note. So I could grab these two hi-hats, bring them up to the claps, and then just remove these extraneous parts, and now we've got a bit more of a cohesive groove. Now, it's worth noting this can also be done inside of Ableton Live with grooves, and other DAWs have very similar features. I'll be doing a video all about grooves in a little bit, so make sure to stay subscribed if you want to see that one. And the last and final thing we can do to make our drum patterns unique is to add some variations and fills by extending out the lengths of our patterns. So let's showcase this first with a new 4-to-the-floor beat. Let's add a kick drum to every single beat, a snare to every backbeat, and an open hi-hat on every offbeat. And let's start to add some interesting syncopation here. For example, let's go to our clap and add that first syncopated rhythm that we covered before. But I want to now extend this out, so instead of just repeating a 1-bar pattern, we're repeating a 2-bar pattern. You can do this in whatever way your DAW will allow you to do it, but in Ableton Live, all I need to do is click this duplicate button. And that will take that 1-bar pattern that we've got and duplicate it into a 2-bar pattern. And now in order to add some variation, I could just adjust this clap pattern the second time that it happens. And now I can add what is known as a drum fill. A fill is basically some kind of interesting pattern that generally occurs at the end of a extended pattern, like every 2 or 4 bars, that leads in nicely to the looping around of the drum beat or leads in nicely to the next section. As an example here, I could create a drum fill with our high, mid, and low toms. So let's now take our 2-bar pattern and duplicate it out into a 4-bar long pattern by clicking that duplicate button. And now in our last bar of this pattern, let's add some interesting tom movement on these syncopated notes. So we might start with a high tom, and let's go down into our mid toms a little bit. Something like that. Let's take a listen to what this sounds like. So you can see how I added some extra interest there, leading back into the loop around of this 4-bar pattern. You could even go further and accentuate the start of this pattern by adding a crash cymbal on the downbeat, and potentially even fill it out a bit more by adding, say, a ride cymbal onto every single beat. In order to stop these rides from getting a little bit too overpowering, I'm going to pull down these velocities. And here's our variation and extension on our 4-to-the-floor drum pattern. Now, just a quick note that you typically don't want too many variations and differing fills and stuff going on throughout the entirety of your track. Instead, you want to have a few that you just kind of repeat to keep some consistency and cohesiveness across the entirety of the track. Now, you can take these same techniques and ideas and apply them to a 2-step pattern or whatever other kind of drum beat you're creating. But if you want to take these techniques a little bit further, check out this video right here where I go through how you can create your very own authentic sounding drum break. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.